Have you ever shared a bed with someone and realized, only much later, that they were never counting the years with you? They were counting the years until you. 7 years ago, my husband stood over me in a hospital room on the 14th floor of a Seattle medical center, with the rain streaking down the windows and the gray sound of Puget Sound somewhere in the distance. He didn't cry. He didn't pray. He straightened his cufflinks, looked at the doctor, and said the words that were supposed to end my story permanently. She wouldn't want to live like this. He said it calmly, the way men like him say everything, like cruelty is just efficiency wearing a better suit. He signed the paperwork. He collected the insurance. He walked out into a Seattle drizzle, got into his car, and drove back to the life he was already building on top of my grave. He thought I was gone. But the thing about a woman who has survived the person who was supposed to protect her, she doesn't just heal. She recalibrates. I didn't crawl back into his world. I disappeared into a different one entirely. One built in the quiet, glass and steel underworld of the Pacific Northwest, where the most powerful rooms have no signs on the door, and the most dangerous men wear suits that cost more than most people's mortgages. I rebuilt myself in silence, in the gray corridors of a city that keeps its secrets better than anywhere else in America. In the orbit of a man whose loyalty is written permanently into his skin, a man whose name, spoken in the wrong circle in Seattle, clears a room faster than a fire alarm. If you believe that every woman who was discarded deserves to become inevitable, stay. This is the story of the woman they unplugged in Seattle and everything she came back to collect. Before we witness the moment Malcolm realizes he didn't just lose a wife, he lost his soul. I need you to take a second for yourself. If you believe that a woman's worth isn't defined by the man who walked away, but by the strength she finds to rise again, and if you believe that true love doesn't just hold your hand, it protects your peace, then subscribe to Area More Stories right now. By hitting that like button, you aren't just supporting a story, you're honoring every heart that has been shattered and had the courage to rebuild. Malcolm Brooks had always been good at reframing things. It was, perhaps, his greatest talent, greater than his Harvard degree, greater than his ability to close a deal in under an hour, greater even than the carefully constructed smile he gave to cameras. He could take something ugly and dress it in language so clean, so measured, that people walked away nodding instead of questioning. So when the doctor handed him the form, he didn't think of it as ending her life. He thought of it as making a decision she couldn't make for herself. She wouldn't want to live like this, he told the attending physician. Then he told the same thing to her sister, who flew in from Phoenix with red eyes and shaking hands. He said it so many times, with such practiced heaviness in his voice, that he almost believed it himself. Almost. He signed the form at 11:14 in the morning. He remembers the time because he had a lunch meeting at 1 o'clock that he did not cancel. The press coverage came 2 days later. Devoted husband makes impossible choice. He wore a navy suit for the interview. Not black. That would have looked performative. Navy read as grief-adjacent, controlled. The kind of man who holds himself together for everyone else. His assistant forwarded him the quarterly projections during the commercial break. By Friday, the life insurance claim was filed. By the following month, her accounts, the ones she'd built quietly, carefully over 9 years of marriage, had been redirected, consolidated, absorbed. He told himself he deserved it, that carrying the weight of that decision had a cost. He never once considered that she might still be breathing. That was his first mistake. And in Malcolm Brooks's life, it would prove to be the only one that mattered. The first thing she heard was rain. Not voices, not the mechanical rhythm of machines, not the careful footsteps of nurses moving through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and quiet grief. Just rain, against glass. Steady and indifferent. the way Seattle always was, like the city had never once considered stopping for anyone. She didn't open her eyes immediately. Something in her, some deep animal instinct sharpened by weeks of darkness, told her to be still first. To listen first. To understand the room before she let the room understand her. The ceiling was white when she finally looked at it. Institutional. Unmemorable. A single fluorescent light hummed faintly overhead like a secret it didn't know how to keep. Room 402. She knew the number before she saw it. It was on the whiteboard across from her bed, written in blue marker beside a date that stopped her breathing for a full 3 seconds. She had been in this room for 31 days. 31 days, and not a single visitor had signed the log on the door. She found that out from a young nurse named Dana who had the kind of honest face that couldn't hold a comfortable lie. Dana had assumed someone told her. Dana had assumed wrong. "Your husband," Dana began carefully, smoothing the edge of a blanket that didn't need smoothing. "He made the arrangements. He was very—" A pause, a swallow, a search for the right word. Decisive. Decisive. She turned that word over in her mind like a stone in her palm, felt the weight of it, felt its edges. The paperwork was filed. The order had been signed. By all legal and medical accounts, she was a woman who was supposed to have stopped breathing 3 weeks ago. The anomaly, some stubborn, inexplicable refusal by her body to follow instructions, had confused the attending physicians and complicated a process that her husband had clearly intended to be clean and final. He had not come back to check. That told her everything she would ever need to know about the man she had married. She didn't cry. She noticed that about herself and filed it away like a relevant piece of data. No tears, no trembling, just a long, slow exhale, and then something else. Something quieter and more permanent than rage. Something that didn't have a name yet, but lived in the center of her chest like an ember that had decided, against all probability, to keep burning. She asked Dana for a mirror. She looked at herself for a long time. At the woman in the reflection, thinner now, yes, hollowed in places, but her eyes were the same deep espresso brown they had always been. And they were steady. Good, she thought. She was going to need that. She set the mirror down, turned toward the rain-streaked window, and began. Quietly, carefully, without a single word spoken aloud. I wasn't supposed to be in that room. The invitation had been meant for a man named Garrett Cole, a logistics consultant I'd been quietly ghosting for 3 weeks while I borrowed his credentials, his contacts, and his reputation to get myself back into rooms that required a name people recognized. Garrett never showed. I did. The meeting was in a private floor of a Belltown tower, the kind of building that doesn't have a public directory. Floor-to-ceiling glass. The whole of Elliott Bay spread out below like something God arranged specifically for negotiations. He was already seated when I walked in. Han Ji-woon. Though I didn't know his name yet. I only knew the stillness of him, the way a man who has never needed to perform power simply holds it, the way the room seemed to reorganize itself around where he was sitting. He looked up when I entered. Just once. Those near black eyes moved across me the way a chess player scans a board. Not with hunger, not with dismissal, but with the particular attention of someone cataloging what is useful. I sat down across from him and opened the folder I wasn't supposed to have. He let me speak for 4 minutes without interrupting. Then he leaned forward, just slightly, and said, in perfect, unhurried English, "You didn't come here for the contract." It wasn't a question. I met his gaze and held it. "Neither did you," I said. The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to become something else entirely. He didn't see a woman with scars that hadn't finished healing. He saw a strategist. And he smiled. Just barely. Like he'd been waiting for someone like me for a long time. She learned that power never raises its voice. It doesn't need to. In those first months inside Ji-woon's world, Celine watched more than she spoke. She sat in rooms where decisions worth millions were made in whispers, where a single nod carried more weight than a contract, where the most dangerous men she had ever encountered moved through space like they owned the air inside it. She studied all of it, memorized the rhythm of it, and slowly, deliberately, she began to move the same way. Ji-woon never treated her like a project, never handed her a curriculum or mapped out her education. He simply included her, pulled out the chair beside him at the table, slid documents across to her before his own lieutenants, and watched with those near black eyes as she found her footing without being told where to step. "You already know how to think," he told her once, his voice low, Seattle's skyline glittering behind him through floor-to-ceiling glass. "You just stopped trusting it." She didn't respond, but something in her chest shifted, quietly, like a lock turning. He noticed things about her that Malcolm never once looked for. The way her posture changed when she was calculating. The particular stillness that meant she had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. He never made her feel observed. He made her feel seen, which was an entirely different, far more dangerous thing. She stopped flinching at silence. She stopped explaining herself. She learned that her composure was not a wound she was hiding behind. It was a weapon she was learning to carry. And on the nights Seattle's rain hammered the windows and Ji-woon sat close enough that their shoulders almost touched, she let herself feel it. Not weakness, warmth. Malcolm Brooks had always believed that a man's worth could be measured in square footage. His penthouse sat on the 42nd floor of a Belltown tower, the windows framing the gray expanse of Puget Sound, like a painting he'd commissioned specifically to remind visitors of his altitude. 7 years ago, standing in that hospital room with a pen in his hand, he had told himself that difficult men make difficult decisions. That sentiment had carried him far. Not far enough. The call started in January. Quiet at first. A delayed contract here, a withdrawn investor there. By March they were louder. By May they were the only sound in the room. His logistics empire, built on aggressive acquisitions and carefully maintained illusions, was hemorrhaging from the inside. A competitor had moved into his Pacific corridor. 3 of his anchor clients had quietly migrated. His CFO had resigned without a forwarding address. He sat now at the head of his boardroom table, alone, jacket off, tie loosened, staring at a financial projection that looked less like a chart and more like a eulogy. The Seattle rain pressed against the glass. Nobody knocked. Nobody came. The Han Group was his last option. He knew it the way a drowning man knows the distance to shore, with terrible clarity and very little dignity. They controlled more of the Pacific Northwest's underground logistics network than any federal agency had successfully documented. Legitimate on the surface, immovable beneath it. If they agreed to absorb his failing contracts and stabilize his supply chain, he could survive the year. He had placed the call 3 weeks ago. The meeting had been granted without negotiation, without questions. That should have unsettled him. It didn't. He was too desperate to read the room. 4 miles away, in a private residence overlooking Lake Union, the lights were low and the city hummed quietly below the glass. Ji-woon stood behind Celine, his hands resting on her shoulders with the particular gentleness of a man who has only ever been gentle with one person. She sat at the edge of the window, composed as always, watching the rain map itself across the surface of the lake. "He confirmed," she said. "I know." His thumbs moved slowly along the line of her shoulder blades. Not possessive, deliberate. Like a man reminding himself that she was real and present and still here. He leaned down, his lips finding the curve of her neck just below her jaw. He stayed there a moment longer than necessary. "You don't have to be in that room," he murmured against her skin. "Yes, she said quietly. I do. He straightened. His hand moved from her shoulder to the side of her face, tilting it gently upward until her steady espresso brown eyes found his near black ones. Then I'll be behind you, he said, like I always am. She didn't smile, but something in her eyes settled, like a weapon being cocked. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. No letterhead, no return address. Just a single card, cream-colored and heavy, the kind of paper that announces itself before you've read a word. Embossed at the top in clean black ink. Han Pacific Group, Seattle. And below that, a time, an address in Belltown. And 4 words that Malcolm would later say felt less like an invitation and more like a summons from God. We should meet. Tomorrow. He read it 3 times, standing at his desk, the city spread out gray and glittering behind him through the floor-to-ceiling glass. His assistant had no record of how it arrived. No courier log. No email trail. It had simply appeared. The way trouble always does. Quietly. And without warning. He told himself it was opportunity. The Han Pacific Group had been a ghost in Seattle's financial underground for 3 years. No public profile. No press. Just results. Quiet acquisitions, restructured empires, boardrooms that went in broken and came out remade. Exactly what Malcolm needed. Exactly what he'd been praying for since the hostile takeover began eating through his company like rot through timber. He spent that evening preparing, rehearsing. He chose the charcoal suit, his best one, the one he wore when he needed to feel like the most powerful man in the room. He polished his shoes, set out his most expensive watch. He needed to project strength, control, the language of a man who still had leverage. He had none, but he didn't know that yet. He slept well that night, which would later strike him as almost poetic. Because somewhere across the city, in a high-rise office with rain-blurred windows and no name on the door, I was already waiting. I had been waiting for 7 years. The boardroom on the 32nd floor of the Belltown Tower was the kind of room that was designed to make people feel small. Floor-to-ceiling glass, a table that stretched like a runway. Seattle spread out below like a gray painting, the sound flat and cold in the distance, the skyline indifferent. Malcolm walked in at 2:03 p.m., 3 minutes late. Deliberate. He still believed tardiness was a power move. He set his leather portfolio on the table, adjusted his cufflinks, and surveyed the room with the practiced confidence of a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved to be in it. There was a woman already seated at the far end of the table. Her back was to the light. Her face was in shadow. One hand rested on the table, still, unhurried, a single delicate gold chain catching the only warmth in the room. He assumed she was an assistant. I was told I'd be meeting with the principal, he said, not quite looking at her. Is Mr. Han running behind? She didn't answer immediately. She let the silence sit between them the way only people who own rooms can afford to. Then she reached forward and turned the small lamp on the table toward herself. The light found her slowly. Her cheekbones first, then the steady espresso brown eyes that had once looked at him across a different table, in a different life, full of a trust he had quietly decided to bury. She looked at him the way a woman looks at something she has already finished calculating. Hello, Malcolm. 3 seconds of silence. Then the leather portfolio slipped from his fingers and hit the floor. And she didn't flinch. Not even slightly. The name came out of his mouth like he still owned it. Celine. Not a question. Not relief. Not even shock. Not yet. Just that old, reflexive authority. On the way he used to say it across a dinner table when she'd said something that embarrassed him in front of guests. Clipped. Corrective. A single word that was really a leash. She didn't move. She was sitting at the head of the Belltown high-rise boardroom, one hand resting on the glass table, the Seattle skyline gray and endless behind her. Her structured black dress caught no light and needed none. Her hair was pulled back so severely it looked architectural. Her eyes, those deep espresso eyes that had once looked at him with something close to love, were now simply measuring him. She let the silence breathe. Malcolm straightened. She watched him do it. Watched him reach for the thing that had always worked before. Posture, presence. The performance of a man who is still in control of the room. "I don't know what you think this is," he said, his voice dropping to that register he reserved for boardrooms and arguments he intended to win. "But whatever arrangement you have here, whatever this is," he gestured vaguely, dismissively, at the room, at her, at the life she had built without him. "It doesn't change what exists legally between us. You are still my wife." There it was. His last card. Played like a weapon. Like 7 years hadn't happened. Like a signature on a hospital form hadn't happened. Like he could still reach across the distance she had carved between them and remind her that she once belonged to him. Selene tilted her head, just slightly, the way she did when she had already anticipated something and was simply waiting for it to finish arriving. She said nothing. And then, the temperature in the room changed, and it didn't happen loudly. There was no door slam, no dramatic entrance, just a shift. The way a room shifts when something genuinely dangerous decides to make itself known. Han Ji-woon stepped out of the shadow at the far end of the boardroom. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way men move when they have never once in their lives needed to hurry. His black suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes settling on Malcolm with the quiet patience of someone who has already decided the outcome of a situation and is simply allowing it to unfold. The tattoo on his neck, black ink, intricate, disappearing beneath his collar like a secret the skin couldn't contain, caught the light as he positioned himself behind Selene's chair, not touching her, not needing to. Just there. Malcolm's mouth opened, then closed. The watch on his wrist suddenly felt very loud. Ji-woon said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply looked at Malcolm the way a man looks at something that has already been handled. And Malcolm, for the first time in 7 years, felt the full weight of what he had thrown away. He thought she would scream at him. That was what men like Malcolm always expected. Volume, tears, the performance of pain. It would have made him comfortable. It would have given him something to dismiss. Selene gave him nothing of the sort. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of that Belltown high-rise, her back to him, watching the rain move across Elliott Bay in slow gray sheets. Her posture was immaculate. Her hands were still. She looked like a woman who had already finished grieving something a long time ago and had simply moved on to the paperwork. "You have 72 hours, she said, without turning around. "After that, the accounts close and the transfer's complete. Your lawyers can call ours, but I'd advise you not to waste the time." Malcolm's voice came out thinner than he intended. "Selene, we can talk about this. After everything we what?" She turned then, slowly, the way she did everything now, like time was a resource she had learned never to waste on people who didn't deserve it. Her eyes found his, steady and dark, and entirely unmoved, and whatever sentence he had been building simply collapsed in his throat. "You held a pen over my life," she said quietly. "You decided what I was worth. You collected the money and you went home." She tilted her head, just slightly. "I'm simply doing the same thing. I've decided what you're worth. It turns out the number is much smaller than you thought." Behind her, near the door, Ji-woon stood without a word. He hadn't spoken once during the entire meeting. He didn't need to. His presence was its own language, fluent, final, and completely without mercy. Malcolm had stopped looking at him 20 minutes ago because looking at him made the floor feel unstable. The documents were already signed. The building Malcolm had built his identity around, the corner office, the company his father had handed him, the portfolio he had padded with her money after she was gone. All of it had moved, quietly and legally, into holdings that no longer bore his name. He hadn't even seen it happening. That was the part that would haunt him longest. Not the loss itself, but the silence in which it was executed. No drama, no announcement. Just the slow, precise removal of everything he had used to convince himself he was significant. Celine picked up her coat from the chair. Ji-woon moved to the door without being asked, opening it the way a man does when a room has already served its purpose. She paused at the threshold and looked back at Malcolm one final time. Not with hatred, not with satisfaction, with the calm, unhurried expression of a woman who had simply finished something she started 7 years ago in a hospital room, while the rain fell over Seattle and a man she once loved signed her life away. She walked out. She didn't look back again. If this moved something in you, if Celine's silence said something your own words haven't been able to yet, hit the subscribe button. For me, and maybe, somewhere in it, the next chapter of yours. Like this if you believe that the women who survive the hardest rooms deserve to inherit them. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that being discarded is not the same as being finished.